My sister-in-law Vanessa did not check in on me for 4 years. Not a single text message, not one phone call to see if my family was even surviving. But there we were at her lavish Christmas dinner surrounded by crystal glasses, expensive holiday decorations, and completely fake smiles. She leaned across the massive mahogany dining table, her eyes full of intense malice, and asked how my worthless little lotion hustle was doing. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, smiled pleasantly, and told her I sold the company so I could stay home and raise my child. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the room. "Let me guess," she sneered. "You got a few $1,000s to pay off your maxed-out credit cards. How much did you actually get for it?" I looked her dead in the eyes, ensuring she heard every single syllable, and said I sold it for $600 million. The heavy silver fork slipped from her husband DeAndre's hand, clattering loudly against the fine bone china. The entire dining room fell dead silent. "My name is Nia, and I am 32 years old. Before I tell you exactly how a supposed freeloader ended up completely owning the very ground my wealthy, arrogant in-laws walk on, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your worth and tried to tear you down. To truly understand the absolute shock on their faces at that Christmas dinner, you have to understand the nightmare that happened 4 years earlier. It was a suffocatingly hot and humid Atlanta afternoon. I was exactly 8 months pregnant with my son, carrying so much physical weight and emotional terror that I could barely breathe. My husband Trayvon and I were sitting in his mother Brenda's living room. The room was perfectly sterile and deeply intimidating, filled with expensive white leather furniture that nobody was ever allowed to sit on comfortably. The air conditioning was cranked up so aggressively high that I was shivering, though looking back maybe my trembling was just pure anxiety. Trayvon had just lost his job as a financial analyst 2 days prior. A massive corporate downsizing had wiped out his entire department without any warning or severance package. We suddenly had absolutely no incoming revenue, a baby arriving in 4 short weeks, and our savings were rapidly depleting from medical bills. But my business, a business-to-business technology platform designed to optimize supply chain logistics for independent Black-owned beauty brands, was right on the verge of a major industry breakthrough. I just needed a little more financial runway to secure my server costs and keep the platform operational. I swallowed my pride, gripping the cold arm of the pristine white sofa, and looked directly at my mother-in-law. "Brenda," I said, my voice tight with desperation and anxiety. "We are in a really tough spot right now. Trayvon is applying everywhere, sending out dozens of resumes a day, but we need a financial bridge to get through the next few months until he secures something stable. I need $10,000 to keep my company servers running and cover our basic living expenses until he lands a new position. I promise we will draft a legal contract and pay you back with interest the moment we are stable." Brenda slowly lowered her delicate porcelain teacup to the glass saucer. She looked at me not with a mother's sympathy, but with cold, calculating judgment. Her eyes swept over my swollen belly, lingering on my modest maternity clothes, and then moved up to stare harshly into my face. $10,000, she repeated flatly, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. "You want $10,000 of my hard-earned money to fund a fantasy while my son is out of work and facing ruin?" Trayvon intervened immediately, leaning forward with his hands clasped together. "Mom Nia's platform is gaining serious traction in the market. It is a legitimate tech startup, not just an idea. We just need a short-term loan to survive this gap. We would never ask you for this money if it was not an absolute emergency for our family." Brenda adjusted her rigid posture deliberately, showing off the heavy diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. "Trevin, you have always been entirely too soft when it comes to her," Brenda scolded. "You lost your high-paying job, and instead of your wife stepping up to provide realistic stability for her impending child, she is begging for a massive handout to play entrepreneur. Real businesses make actual money, Nia. They do not drain a family dry right before a baby is born. You need to abandon this foolishness and face reality." I felt hot tears stinging the back of my eyes, but I absolutely refused to let them fall in front of her. I had grown up in a rough neighborhood on the south side of Atlanta. I did not have trust funds, generational wealth, or wealthy parents to act as my safety net. I had fought tooth and nail for my college education, working 3 jobs just to graduate. I knew what it meant to hustle and sacrifice, but Brenda only saw me as someone vastly beneath her carefully curated social standing. Because I did not come from a lineage of doctors and lawyers like her family, my ambitions were nothing more than a pathetic delusion in her eyes. I opened my mouth to explain our user growth metrics, to show her the actual data proving the platform was viable and growing by 20% a month. But before I could get a single word out, the heavy oak doors to the living room swung wide open with a dramatic crash. Vanessa, my 35-year-old sister-in-law, marched into the room like she owned the world. She must have been eavesdropping in the hallway the entire time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She was wearing head-to-toe designer labels, holding a luxury leather handbag that cost significantly more than the loan I was desperately asking for. She threw her head back and let out a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed maliciously off the high vaulted ceilings. "A tech startup!" Vanessa shrieked, clutching her stomach as if it was the funniest joke she had ever heard in her life. "Oh, please save us the corporate jargon. Do not try to dress it up with fancy business words to impress my mother. You are mixing cheap body butters in your kitchen and selling them to your broke friends on Instagram. It is a worthless little lotion hustle, Nia. Do not insult our intelligence by calling it a tech company. It is a logistics software platform," I corrected her, my voice shaking violently with a mixture of intense pregnancy hormones and pure, unfiltered rage. "We manage supply chains and distribution channels for independent beauty brands across the country. It is a business-to-business technology company that is solving a massive gap in the market." Vanessa waved her manicured hand dismissively, stepping aggressively closer to where I was sitting. "Whatever you want to call it, it is making exactly $0 and causing my brother unnecessary stress. You have a lot of nerve coming into this beautiful house, sitting on that couch, and begging my mother to fund your little imaginary hobby while you carry a child you clearly cannot afford." Traven stood up quickly, placing his body firmly between me and his sister. "Vanessa, back off right now. This is absolutely none of your business. We are having a private financial conversation with Mom, and you are completely out of line. It is absolutely my business when your freeloader wife tries to drag you down into the dirt and exploit our mother for cash." Vanessa fired back, her voice raising to a hostile shout. "Look at her, Trayvon. She is 8 months pregnant, you are totally unemployed, and she is still trying to bleed our family dry to avoid getting a real job. She has always been a gold digger. She saw your earning potential in college and latched onto you because she knew she could never amount to anything on her own." I stood up as quickly as my heavy, aching body would allow, ignoring the sharp pain shooting down my lower back. "I am not a freeloader," I said, staring directly into Vanessa's furious eyes with every ounce of strength I had left. "I have worked for absolutely everything I have ever gotten in this life. You were handed your cushy job at your husband DeAndre's firm because you married into his money and his status. You do not know the very first thing about building something from nothing because you have never had to struggle a single day in your pampered life." Vanessa scoffed loudly, stepping right into my personal space, her expensive perfume suffocating me. "What exactly have you built, Nia? Name one successful thing you have done in your entire life besides getting pregnant to permanently trap my brother. You are dragging him into poverty because of your selfish pride. You should be deeply embarrassed to even show your face here today. You should be out looking for a real job, working the register at a grocery store, scrubbing floors, doing whatever it takes to support your growing family instead of begging for handouts. But no, you want to play CEO while my brother suffers the consequences of your delusions." Brenda simply sat on the couch, sipping her tea, watching her daughter verbally assault a heavily pregnant woman without saying a single word of reprimand or defense. She agreed with every hateful word Vanessa was saying. To them, my lack of generational wealth meant my ideas were inherently worthless, and my presence in their family was a disease. They looked at my background and decided my ceiling. "You are pathetic," Vanessa sneered, looking me up and down with absolute, unfiltered disgust. A real woman would put her family first and swallow her useless pride. But you just want to pretend you are important. You will never be anything more than a girl from the hood trying to play dress-up in our world. Go find a real job and stop trying to steal our money to fund your miserable failures. Before I could even formulate a response to Vanessa, a deep mocking chuckle resonated from the arched doorway leading into the formal dining room. DeAndre, Vanessa's husband, strolled into the living area with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his bank account balance made him a living god. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit that likely cost more than my entire server hosting budget for the fiscal year. He made sure to casually adjust his heavy gold Rolex as he walked toward us, ensuring the diamonds caught the light. DeAndre was a junior vice president at a legacy investment fund in downtown Atlanta. He came from old money, the kind of generational wealth that allowed him to view anyone outside his exclusive tax bracket as inherently inferior. To DeAndre, people did not earn respect through grinding hard work or brilliant innovation. They earned it by having the right last name, attending the right private schools, and living in the right zip code. He stood next to his wife, placing a possessive manicured hand on her shoulder, and looked at Trayvon with absolute, unadulterated pity. Trayvon, man, you are letting this situation get completely out of hand, DeAndre said, shaking his head slowly as if addressing a disobedient child rather than a grown man. I cannot believe you are actually standing here letting your pregnant wife beg your mother for pocket change. It is incredibly embarrassing to watch. As a man, you are supposed to be the sole provider, the unshakable head of the household. Instead, you are letting her play business and drag your dignity through the mud for everyone to see. Trevin clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. My husband was a good, hard-working financial analyst who had lost his job due to a massive corporate merger that was entirely out of his control. He was not lazy. He was a victim of a brutal, unforgiving economy. But DeAndre did not care about context or economic realities. DeAndre only cared about optics and maintaining his bloated sense of superiority. Do not talk to me about providing. DeAndre. Trevon warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. You do not know the very first thing about our financial situation, or what my wife is actively building. DeAndre let out another patronizing laugh, waving his free hand in the air dismissively. Please, Trevon, what she is building is a complete, utter fantasy. I look at professional pitch decks for a living. I sit in elite boardrooms with actual founders who secure millions in seed funding. Your wife does not even know what a real cap table looks like. She is operating a glorified charity project from a cramped, cheap apartment, and you are foolish enough to indulge her wild delusions. You lost your job, man. It happens. But allowing her to pretend she is some tech CEO instead of facing harsh reality and getting a steady paycheck is just pathetic leadership on your part. I felt my breath hitch sharply in my throat, my vision blurred with hot tears of sheer indignation, but I forced my chin up, refusing to let them see me break. The profound disrespect in the room was suffocating. I had spent countless sleepless nights coding networking and cold-calling manufacturers, while DeAndre attended exclusive country club mixers. He had never once asked to see my business model or my user acquisition data. He simply looked at my humble background, looked at my gender, and decided my life's work was a cute, insignificant hobby. DeAndre continued his arrogant monologue, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice. Do you know how incredibly hard it is to build a successful software platform? He asked rhetorically, pacing slowly and deliberately in front of us. It requires massive capital elite pedigree and deep industry connections. It requires a vast network of angel investors who implicitly trust your background. You do not have the network, Nia. You do not have the pedigree. You are just a girl from the south side of Atlanta who managed to marry up, and now you are trying to act like the next big tech visionary. It is deeply insulting to those of us who actually put in the grueling work to maintain our high status in the corporate world. My firm would toss your amateur business plan into the shredder before you even made it past our front receptionist. Vanessa smirked, crossing her arms over her chest with a look of pure, malicious triumph. Tell her, babe. She desperately needs to hear the harsh truth. She has been riding Trayvon's coattails since we were all in college, and now that he hit a temporary speed bump, she expects Mom to open her checkbook and save the day. It is an absolute disgrace to our prestigious family name. DeAndre then reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek designer leather wallet. He opened it slowly, deliberately, making sure we could all clearly see the thick stack of high-denomination bills resting inside. He pulled out a crisp, brand-new $100 bill and held it loosely between his index and middle finger. He looked down at my swollen stomach, then up to my face with an expression of utter, unmasked disgust. "Here," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with venomous, mocking charity. He extended his arm and casually dropped the $100 bill. It fluttered in the over-conditioned air, drifting back and forth before landing softly on the pristine white carpet, directly at the tips of my shoes. "Go buy some diapers and get a real job, Nia. Leave the serious business world to people who actually belong in it." The silence that followed the dropped bill was deafening and heavy. Trayvon stared at the money resting on the floor, his entire body rigid with an explosive anger I had rarely seen in him. He stepped forward, bridging the physical gap between himself and his smug brother-in-law. The sheer size difference was notable. Trayvon was taller and much broader from years of playing competitive college sports, while DeAndre relied entirely on his financial status to intimidate people. "Pick it up," Trayvon said. His voice was no longer a gentle warning. It was a direct, unwavering command. It was cold, sharp, and stripped of all familial respect or polite restraint. DeAndre scoffed, though he took a slight involuntary step backward toward his wife. "Excuse me? Are you serious right now?" "I said pick the damn money up and apologize to my wife, Trayvon," repeated, stepping even closer, closing the distance aggressively. "You do not ever disrespect the mother of my child. You do not throw money at her like she is garbage on the street. Pick it up right now, DeAndre, or I swear to God I will physically make you pick it up." Vanessa gasped dramatically, clutching DeAndre's arm tightly as if she were in actual danger. "Mom, are you really going to let him violently threaten my husband in your house? Trayvon has completely lost his mind." This was the defining moment. The critical juncture where a mother should have intervened to demand basic respect for her pregnant daughter-in-law. I looked at Brenda, desperately praying she would finally see the absolute cruelty radiating from her daughter and son-in-law. I waited for her to tell DeAndre he was entirely out of line to demand he pick up his highly disrespectful handout. Instead, Brenda stood up from the white leather sofa, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse with calculated, chilling precision. She looked directly at Trayvon, her expression completely devoid of any maternal warmth or empathy. "Trayvon, you will absolutely not raise your voice to DeAndre in my home," Brenda ordered sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "DeAndre is absolutely right. He is a successful, providing man who takes excellent, luxurious care of your sister. He is trying to give you a much-needed harsh reality check because you clearly lack the strength and fortitude to discipline your own household. DeAndre stepped up to offer you charity because you are miserably failing to provide for your pregnant wife, and instead of showing basic fundamental gratitude, you are violently threatening him." Trayvon stared at his mother in complete, heartbroken disbelief. Gratitude. "Mom, he threw money at Nia's feet. He deeply humiliated her. How can you possibly stand there and defend his actions because he is telling the painful truth?" Brenda fired back, her voice echoing harshly through the pristine living room. "I am incredibly disappointed in you, Trayvon. We raised you to be a highly successful man, a man who marries a woman of equal social standing and ambition. Instead, you stubbornly married a girl who refuses to accept her proper place in society. And now, when you are unemployed and highly vulnerable, she is demanding my hard-earned money to fund her ridiculous, impossible delusions." Brenda walked slowly toward us, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor surrounding the plush area rug. She stopped just inches from Trayvon, aggressively ignoring my presence entirely, as if I were totally invisible. "I am going to give you a choice right now, Trayvon," Brenda said, her tone absolute and unyielding. "You are going to make your wife shut down this ridiculous startup today. You are going to force her to go out and get a regular 9-to-5 job so she can contribute to your household like a responsible adult. If you do that, I will write you a check for $5,000 to help cover your rent until you find a new position. If you refuse, if you continue to let her drag you down and enable this freeloader mentality, then you can walk out of my front door right now, and you will not be welcomed back. I will not fund your downfall, and I will not allow my money to be wasted on a woman who refuses to work a real job. You either force her to quit playing CEO, or I am cutting you out of this family entirely. No financial help, no holiday dinners, absolutely nothing. Choose your path right now. Trayvon did not blink. He did not flinch. The heavy, suffocating silence in the pristine living room seemed to stretch for an eternity, magnifying the absolute absurdity of his mother's ultimatum. He looked at Brenda, tracing the harsh, unyielding lines of her face, and then his gaze shifted to Vanessa and DeAndre, who stood shoulder to shoulder like a pair of victorious vultures waiting to pick our bones clean. They expected him to fold. They had spent his entire life conditioning him to bow to financial pressure and familial guilt. But in that defining moment, looking at the toxic hierarchy that demanded my subjugation in exchange for their conditional love, Trevin transformed. His posture shifted from defensive aggression to a calm, terrifying detachment. The rigid tension in his shoulders melted away, replaced by the profound clarity of a man who had just witnessed the true ugly nature of his own bloodline. He looked down at the crisp $100 bill still resting innocently on the white carpet. He did not reach for it. He did not even gesture toward it. He simply let it sit there as a pathetic monument to DeAndre's fragile ego. "Keep your money, Mom." Trevon said, his voice dropping to a register so incredibly cold and steady that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Keep your conditional love. Keep your holiday dinners and your country club memberships and your endless, exhausting judgments. If the price of being part of this family is breaking my wife's spirit and forcing her to abandon her dreams just to make you and Vanessa feel superior, then the price is far too high. I am not paying it. Not today, not ever." Brenda's jaw dropped. The polished, unbothered facade cracked instantly, revealing a flash of genuine panic. She had overplayed her hand, assuming her financial leverage was absolute. "Trayvon," she warned, her voice rising in pitch, "do not walk away from me. If you walk out that door, you are dead to me. You will get nothing. You will be entirely on your own with a baby you cannot afford." "We have always been on our own," Trayvon replied smoothly, turning his attention to DeAndre. "And you, big man, you think throwing a $100 bill at a pregnant woman makes you powerful. It just makes you weak. It proves you have absolutely nothing of value inside you except the balance in your bank account. Enjoy your tailored suits and your empty life. Because when the money fades, you are going to realize you are entirely hollow." Vanessa stepped forward, her face flushed red with sheer indignation. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life, Trayvon. You are choosing a delusional girl from the hood over your own flesh and blood. She is going to drag you down to the gutter with her." Trayvon ignored his sister completely. He turned his back on the three of them, reaching out his large, warm hand. I placed my trembling fingers into his palm, feeling an overwhelming surge of fierce, protective love for this man. My baby kicked hard against my ribs at that exact moment, a sharp reminder of the new family we were creating, a family that would never weaponize love. "Let us go home," Nia Trevon said softly, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute certainty. "We are done here." I nodded, gripping his hand tightly. We turned together and began walking toward the grand entryway. The heavy silence behind us suddenly shattered into a chaotic chorus of angry shouts. Brenda screamed at Trayvon to come back, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, warning him that he was throwing away his birthright. Vanessa yelled something about how we would be begging on the streets within a month. DeAndre laughed, a loud, artificial sound meant to mask his damaged pride. We did not turn around. We did not hesitate. We marched straight through the marble foyer, our footsteps echoing against the expensive tile, a steady drumbeat of our departure. I kept my head held high, refusing to show them even a fraction of the fear gnawing at my stomach. I pushed open the massive front doors, and we stepped out into the thick, humid Atlanta air. The oppressive, freezing air conditioning of Brenda's mansion was instantly replaced by the warm, suffocating heat of the southern summer. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind us with a definitive final thud, echoing across the manicured lawn. The sound severed our ties to their toxic world permanently. We walked down the pristine driveway, leaving behind the luxury cars and the gated security, stepping into a completely uncertain future, but doing it together side by side. We climbed into our reliable but aging sedan. The leather seats were scorching hot from baking in the Georgia sun, but I barely registered the discomfort. Trayvon gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as he started the engine. The drive back to our cramped apartment began in total silence. It was not a tense silence, but rather the heavy, breathless quiet that follows a massive explosion. The adrenaline was slowly leaving my system, replaced by a profound, terrifying reality. We were entirely on our own. Trayvon. I finally whispered, my voice breaking the stillness as we merged onto the highway. I am so sorry. I just cost you your entire family. I cost you your mother and your sister. Trayvon reached across the center console and grabbed my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine. You did not cost me anything, Nia. They cost themselves a son and a brother. They showed me exactly who they are and what they value. I choose you. I choose our son. I choose the future we are building together. But Nia, we are going to have to fight like hell now. I know, I said, looking out the window at the passing city skyline, and I am ready to fight. I have been fighting my entire life. That is what they do not understand, Trayvon. They look at me and they see a charity case. They see a girl from the gritty streets of Zone 6 who got lucky. But they do not see the grit it took just to survive. I turned to look at my husband, desperately needing him to fully understand the fire burning inside me. Vanessa grew up with trust funds and private tutors. When she failed, she had a soft, luxurious mattress of generational wealth to fall back on. When I failed, I had nothing. I grew up watching my mother work double shifts cleaning hotel rooms just to keep the electricity turned on. I taught myself how to code on a battered borrowed laptop at the public library because we could not afford basic Wi-Fi at home. I did not have the luxury of failing gracefully. I did not go to Ivy League networking mixers or have parents who could call in favors. I hustled for every single scholarship, every grant, and every late-night internship. I built my technical knowledge line by line, enduring countless rejections and closed doors. Vanessa thinks success is something you inherit. I know success is something you rip from the hands of a world that wants to keep you at the bottom. Trayvon nodded, keeping his eyes on the road but listening intently. I know, baby. I know your grit better than anyone. That is why I cannot just get a job and shut my company down. I continued, my voice gaining strength and passionate conviction. This software platform is not a hobby. It is not some cute little project I am playing with to pass the time. It is our survival. I have spent the last 3 years analyzing the massive gaps in the beauty supply chain. I know the data intimately. I know the market. Black-owned beauty brands are losing millions in revenue due to fragmented logistics, and my specific code solves that exact systemic problem. If I quit now, I am validating everything DeAndre and Vanessa said about me. I am telling our unborn son that when the rich and powerful mock you, you bow your head and surrender. I refuse to do that. I am building generational wealth for our family with my own 2 hands, and I will not let their arrogance dictate my ceiling. Trayvon pulled the car into the fading asphalt parking lot of our apartment complex. He turned the engine off, unbuckled his seatbelt, and shifted to face me completely. His eyes were fierce and filled with absolute resolve. Then you keep building, he said firmly. You keep coding, you keep pitching, and you keep running your company. I do not care if I have to take a job flipping burgers, stocking warehouse shelves, or scrubbing toilets. I will work night and day to pay our rent and buy the groceries. I will be your safety net. You focus on the platform. We are going to prove them all wrong, Nia. We are going to build an empire in the dark, and we are not going to say a single word to them until we are sitting at the absolute top. I squeezed his hand, fresh tears finally spilling over my eyelashes, but this time they were tears of profound gratitude. We walked up the 3 flights of stairs to our tiny apartment, leaving the toxic shadows of his family behind. The severance was complete. The war had officially begun. The very next morning, we began dismantling our old life to build the unshakable foundation for our new one. We did not have the luxury of time to sit and lick our wounds. Our son, whom we named Malik, arrived 3 short weeks later. He brought a terrifying amount of love into our lives, accompanied by an equally terrifying stack of out-of-pocket medical bills. We brought our beautiful, fragile newborn boy home to an apartment complex we knew we could no longer afford. So we made the hardest, most aggressively practical decisions of our entire lives. We broke our lease, paid the hefty cancellation penalty with the absolute last of our dwindling savings, and packed our entire existence into a rented moving truck. We moved into a cramped single-room studio apartment on the far west side of the city, a neighborhood that looked nothing like the manicured gated communities Trevon had grown up in. The space was so incredibly small that Malik's crib touched the edge of our mattress, and my makeshift desk was practically sitting inside the tiny kitchenette. There was no central air conditioning, just a violently rattling window unit that barely fought off the stifling, oppressive Georgia heat. We sold our reliable aging sedan to a sketchy used car lot for straight cash, handing over the keys and trading our mobility for a few more months of server hosting fees and baby formula. From that day forward, we relied entirely on the erratic Atlanta public transit system, riding crowded, sweltering buses with a stroller in tow. Our diet quickly devolved into whatever was cheapest and most filling. We ate instant ramen noodles, bulk rice, and discount canned beans for nearly every single meal. I learned how to aggressively stretch a $5 chicken across 4 days of dinners. Trevon never complained. He never once looked at his bowl of cheap, salty noodles and mentioned the lavish catering or prime rib dinners at his mother's house. He just ate his food, kissed my forehead, and asked how the code was compiling. To keep a roof over our heads and the electricity running, Trevon swallowed every single ounce of his hard-earned professional pride. The corporate merger had left a noticeable gap on his resume, and desperate times demanded brutally desperate measures. He took a grueling entry-level financial analyst position at a ruthless high-turnover firm downtown. It was a massive, humiliating demotion. He was 34 years old, taking orders and getting aggressively yelled at by arrogant managers fresh out of business school who possessed a fraction of his actual intelligence and life experience. They treated him like highly expendable labor, piling massive, complex workloads on his desk at 5 p.m. and demanding them flawlessly finished by morning. He worked brutal, mind-numbing hours, catching the early bus before the sun even considered rising and returning home long after it had set. He would walk through the door of our tiny studio, his broad shoulders heavy with sheer exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot from staring at microscopic spreadsheets all day. But the very moment he saw me sitting at that cramped kitchen table, typing furiously on my laptop while rocking Malik with my foot, his entire demeanor would instantly change. He would drop his worn briefcase, wash his hands, and immediately take the crying baby from my aching arms. "I have got him, baby," Trevon would whisper, his voice rough, but filled with absolute, unwavering devotion. "You keep building. Do not stop." That was our daily routine. A relentless, exhausting cycle of survival and massive sacrifice. We did not go out. We did not buy new clothes. We did not watch television because we had sold it to pay for a crucial enterprise software license. Every single dollar Trevon brought home was meticulously calculated and aggressively allocated: rent formula, utilities, and platform infrastructure. There was absolutely no room for error, no wealthy safety net to catch us if we stumbled. But in that cramped, sweltering studio, surrounded by the smell of cheap noodles and the sound of city traffic bleeding through the thin, poorly insulated walls, our marriage became an unbreakable fortress. Trevon shielded me from the crushing weight of poverty so I could focus 100% of my mental energy on the tech platform. He willingly took the brutal hits from the corporate world daily just to buy me the precious time I needed to revolutionize my industry. While Trevon fought his grueling battles in the bleak cubicles downtown, I fought mine in the digital trenches. I worked punishing 18-hour days, surviving on dangerous amounts of cheap black coffee and pure, unadulterated willpower. My daily reality consisted of writing thousands of lines of complex supply chain algorithms with one hand while desperately bouncing a colicky infant with the other. The glow of the computer screen was often the only light in the apartment. Malik would sleep strapped to my chest in a worn-out baby carrier, his soft, rhythmic breathing serving as the metronome to my relentless, frantic typing. The platform I was building was designed to completely streamline inventory management, raw ingredient sourcing, and distribution logistics specifically for independent Black-owned beauty brands. It was a multi-billion-dollar market encompassing hair care cosmetics and skincare that legacy tech companies entirely ignored or severely misunderstood. I knew the data intimately. I knew the profound pain points these business owners faced because I had interviewed hundreds of them. But convincing the traditional gatekeepers of wealth to see that massive vision was an entirely different nightmare. I began pitching to venture capital firms via video calls, carefully setting up my laptop in the single quiet corner of our studio with a blank wall behind me while Traven took the baby for a long walk around the block. I sat across digital tables from wealthy, disconnected investors who looked and sounded remarkably like DeAndre. They were men who could not possibly comprehend the massive economic power of the demographic I was fiercely dedicated to serving. They would listen to my pitch, glance at my meticulous financial projections, and offer polite, incredibly condescending smiles. "The market seems a bit too niche," one prominent investor told me, lazily adjusting his expensive glasses. "We are looking for broad, highly scalable solutions, not small lifestyle businesses." Another venture capitalist flatly told me that the supply chain issues I was actively solving simply did not exist because he had never personally experienced them. They looked at my platform and saw exactly what Vanessa had seen. They saw a Black woman from Atlanta trying to hustle lotion. They could not see the revolutionary, highly scalable digital infrastructure I was coding right beneath their arrogant noses. The rejection emails flooded my inbox daily. "We pass. Too early stage. Not a strategic fit for our current portfolio." Each sterile rejection felt like a heavy, suffocating stone placed squarely on my chest. There were dark, terrible nights when the baby was screaming the rent was due, and my primary server crashed, leaving me sobbing silently into my hands so I would not wake Trayvon. The sheer physical and emotional exhaustion was bone-deep, threatening to break my spirit entirely. The temptation to just give up, to apologize to Brenda, beg for her conditional money, and get a normal corporate job was a seductive, toxic poison constantly whispering in the back of my exhausted mind. But whenever that dark thought crept in, whenever my trembling fingers hovered over the keyboard ready to delete the entire project and surrender a very specific memory, would violently pull me back. I would close my eyes and vividly see DeAndre standing in that pristine living room, arrogantly pulling that crisp $100 bill from his designer wallet. I would hear the exact, condescending pitch of Vanessa's laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings as she happily called me a freeloader. I would see Brenda's cold, calculating eyes demanding my absolute submission. The memory of their profound disrespect acted like pure, high-octane rocket fuel injected directly into my veins. Their cruelty became my absolute greatest asset. I refused to let them be right. I refused to let DeAndre's discarded money be the defining narrative of my life. I would sit back up, wipe my face aggressively, and type furiously into the dark night. I completely stopped waiting for the disconnected venture capitalist to validate my worth. I took my platform directly to the business owners I designed it for. I onboarded 5 small beauty brands for free, proving my algorithm could slash their shipping costs by 30% in a single month. Those 5 brands told 10 others. Those 10 told 50. I built my empire in the absolute dark, grinding through the invisible, thankless struggle driven by a burning, relentless desire to make my oppressors choke on their own arrogance. The first 24 months were a brutal, suffocating blur of pure survival. But month 25 changed the trajectory of our entire lives forever. We had been operating in the dark, scraping by on sheer willpower, and Trayvon's meager analyst salary, when one of our earliest beta testers experienced a massive, unprecedented viral moment. They were an independent, Black-owned organic hair care brand operating out of a small warehouse in Brooklyn. A highly influential celebrity randomly posted a glowing review of their deep conditioner on social media, and within 48 hours, they received an astonishing 60,000 orders. Normally, a sudden violent spike in volume like that would completely crush a small independent brand. Their fragile supply chain would snap, leading to catastrophic shipping delays, lost inventory, furious customers, and a public relations nightmare that could bankrupt them. But my platform handled the immense crushing volume flawlessly. The specific algorithms I had written during those dark, sleepless nights in our sweltering studio apartment automatically kicked into high gear. The software instantly rerouted their raw material sourcing perfectly synced with multiple third-party logistics centers across the country and optimized shipping routes in real time to guarantee 2-day delivery. The hair care brand fulfilled every single one of those 60,000 orders ahead of schedule without a single technical glitch. The CEO of that brand was so profoundly amazed by her company's seamless survival that she went on a highly prominent nationally syndicated business podcast. She spent 20 uninterrupted minutes crediting my specific software as the absolute sole reason her company did not collapse under the immense weight of its own sudden success. That single podcast episode acted like a lit match thrown directly into a massive powder keg. Within 48 hours of the broadcast, my inbox, which had previously been a depressing graveyard of arrogant venture capital rejections, was completely overflowing with frantic, desperate inquiries. Independent beauty brands, wellness companies, and boutique cosmetic lines were practically begging for access to our logistics platform. We went from processing a few hundred modest transactions a week to actively managing millions of dollars in complex supply chain logistics every single day. The user growth was not just linear, it was explosive, violent, and completely unprecedented in our specific sector. We were actively solving a critical systemic infrastructure problem that the legacy tech giants had arrogantly ignored for decades, and the market responded by aggressively handing us the keys to the kingdom. Suddenly, those exact same condescending venture capitalists who had previously sneered at my pitch videos were aggressively blowing up my phone. Wealthy men in tailored suits who had flatly told me my ambitious vision was just a cute, insignificant lifestyle business were now flying down to Atlanta on private jets, desperately offering to buy me wildly expensive dinners just to beg for a spot on my capitalization table. I took immense, unadulterated pleasure in ruthlessly rejecting every single firm that had previously mocked me. I remembered their faces, I remembered their dismissive tones, and I shut the door on them permanently. Instead, I deliberately chose to partner with a progressive, highly respected minority-led investment fund for our Series A funding round. The partners at this fund implicitly understood the massive economic power of the demographic I was fiercely dedicated to serving. We secured a staggering $15 million in funding in a matter of weeks. The very day that massive wire transfer officially cleared our corporate banking account, our lives shifted on their axis. Trayvon walked into his miserable, soul-crushing financial analyst job downtown. He marched straight up to the arrogant manager who had spent the last 2 years treating him like highly expendable labor, calmly handed over a brief resignation letter, and walked right back out without saying a single word. He came home to our tiny studio apartment, picked up Malik, and held me so tightly I could barely breathe. We stood in the middle of our cramped kitchen, clutching each other and crying heavy tears of pure, overwhelming relief. My brilliant husband was finally free from the corporate meat grinder. He immediately stepped in as the chief financial officer of my rapidly expanding company, utilizing his elite financial background to fiercely protect the empire we were actively building. With intense capital flowing and Trayvon expertly managing the financial scaling, we poured gasoline on the fire. We moved out of the sweltering studio into a modest, comfortable rental house and hired a brilliant, dedicated team of developers. A year later, our exponential market growth demanded a Series B round, bringing in another $40 million of investment capital. We completely revolutionized the entire independent logistics industry. We built advanced predictive artificial intelligence models that effortlessly foresaw supply chain bottlenecks weeks before they actually happened. We became the absolute gold standard, the invisible ironclad digital backbone powering thousands of highly successful brands across the globe. I was no longer a struggling, ridiculed mother coding desperately in the dark. I was a widely respected, deeply feared, and highly sought-after tech founder. But despite the massive industry success, my face remained completely out of the mainstream media. We strictly maintained our aggressive privacy, keeping our heads down and letting the staggering revenue numbers speak entirely for themselves. Exactly 4 years after we were ruthlessly banished from Brenda's pristine living room, the landscape of our reality fractured again, this time in the most spectacular way imaginable. My company had become a massive, undeniable behemoth in the software space. We controlled a truly staggering percentage of the independent supply chain market, and the legacy corporate giants were suddenly terrified of our market dominance. They realized they could absolutely not compete with our highly specialized, incredibly efficient infrastructure. We were moving too fast, innovating too aggressively, and capturing too much market share. So they decided they had no other choice but to buy us out completely. Enter Apex Holdings. Apex was a ruthless global technology conglomerate, a massive corporate predator universally known for swallowing up highly innovative startups and seamlessly integrating them into their vast portfolio. They had recently acquired several traditional investment funds to aggressively diversify their global assets, consolidating immense financial power across multiple lucrative sectors. Their aggressive acquisition team flew down to Atlanta, bringing an entire army of sharply dressed corporate lawyers and seasoned cutthroat negotiators. They fully expected to steamroll a young, inexperienced black female founder. They expected me to be deeply intimidated by their shiny suits, their aggressive posturing, and their complex corporate jargon. Instead, they sat across a massive mahogany boardroom table from Trayvon and me, and within 15 minutes, they realized they were completely and utterly outmatched. Trayvon had our financial data armored perfectly, anticipating every single one of their valuation arguments before they even opened their mouths. I knew the absolute irreplaceable leverage of my proprietary code. When their lead negotiator confidently slid their initial highly insulting lowball offer across the polished table, I did not even blink. I slid the folder right back to him, leaned forward, and calmly named my actual price. I made it explicitly, undeniably clear that they were not doing me a favor by sitting in my office. I held the permanent keys to the future of retail logistics, and if Apex Holdings wanted to own the kingdom, they were going to pay the king's exact ransom. The intense negotiations were absolutely brutal, lasting for several exhausting, sleepless weeks of back-and-forth legal maneuvering. But whenever the pressure mounted, I remembered the immense grit that got me to this specific table. I vividly remembered the hungry days of eating cheap ramen and aggressively rocking Malik while fighting to keep the servers online. I remembered DeAndre's discarded $100 bill resting on the carpet. I held my ground with absolute terrifying conviction, refusing to concede a single crucial point. Finally, the elite lawyers and executives from Apex Holdings capitulated entirely. The final acquisition contracts were meticulously drawn up, legally verified by our team, and placed securely in front of me. The final staggering acquisition price was exactly $600 million. But I did not just take a massive cash payout and walk away. I aggressively retained a crucial equity stake in the newly merged entity and officially secured a highly powerful seat on the Apex Holdings board of directors, ensuring my overarching vision and my dedicated employees would remain fiercely protected under the new corporate umbrella. I signed my name on the dotted line, my signature legally and permanently transforming my life forever. When the unprecedented sum of money officially hit our banking accounts, Trayvon and I sat in our secure home office staring at the glowing computer screen in complete, overwhelming disbelief. $600 million. The sheer magnitude of the number was almost impossible to fully comprehend. I had miraculously transitioned from a struggling, publicly ridiculed mother begging her cruel mother-in-law for a $10,000 survival loan into a verified, highly influential titan of industry overnight. Our generational wealth was now firmly, undeniably established, locked securely behind ironclad trusts and heavily diversified investment portfolios. We could buy anything we ever wanted, travel anywhere we desired, and ensure Malik would never know a single day of the financial terror we had endured. We had decisively won the brutal war for our independence. We possessed more wealth and corporate power than Vanessa and DeAndre could ever dream of accumulating in 10 lifetimes. But as we held each other tightly celebrating our monumental victory in the quiet privacy of our home, we both knew the most deeply satisfying explosive battle was still yet to come. Despite the staggering $600 million payout settling safely into our diversified investment portfolios, Trevon and I made a highly deliberate strategic decision regarding our immediate future. We absolutely refused to become another flashy, predictable statistic in the newly wealthy Atlanta social scene. We had intimately seen the incredibly toxic, desperate validation-seeking behavior that consumed people like DeAndre and Vanessa. They required constant, exhausting applause from strangers to feel validated in their financial existence. We did not need applause. We needed absolute, untouchable peace. We actively chose a lifestyle of rigorous, uncompromising stealth wealth. The very first thing we did was secure our sanctuary. We bypassed the loud, aggressively flashy neighborhoods of Buckhead, where the newly rich flaunted their heavily mortgaged mansions for social media clout. Instead, we purchased a breathtaking, ultra-private 50-acre equestrian estate in Milton, heavily shielded by a dense, impenetrable forest of old-growth Georgia pines. The property was a masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring a massive indoor pool, a private theater, and a detached guest house for my mother, who had finally retired from her exhausting hotel cleaning jobs to live in absolute comfort. We fortified the estate with military-grade security systems and massive iron gates that ensured our privacy remained entirely unbreached. We did not throw extravagant housewarming parties or invite the local society bloggers to tour our new home. We simply moved in silently, enjoying the profound, luxurious quiet that only extreme wealth can truly provide. Our outward appearance underwent a similar highly strategic transformation. We completely ignored the heavily branded logo-covered designer pieces that my in-laws obsessively worshipped. Instead, Trevon and I exclusively wore bespoke, custom-tailored garments crafted from the finest materials in the world. I wore cashmere sweaters spun in Italy that cost more than a standard mortgage payment. But to the untrained, ignorant eye, they looked like plain, ordinary beige tops. Trevon replaced his cheap department store suits with incredibly sharp, unbranded masterpieces cut by elite tailors in London. We looked exceptionally polished, but our wealth was totally invisible to those who only understood money through the shallow lens of conspicuous consumption. If you knew, you knew. If you did not, you assumed we were simply doing okay. We applied this exact same stealth philosophy to our vehicles. While DeAndre drove a loud, leased neon sports car to desperately signal his perceived corporate dominance, Trevon and I drove the most unassuming luxury vehicles on the market. I drove a heavily armored, fully loaded Volvo SUV that blended perfectly into any suburban grocery store parking lot. Trevon purchased a top-tier luxury sedan in a muted charcoal gray. They were incredibly expensive, exquisitely engineered machines, but they completely deflected any unwanted attention. We moved through the bustling streets of Atlanta like total ghosts, completely undetected by the toxic, status-obsessed crowds. Trevon smoothly transitioned from managing my startup finances to running our incredibly robust family office. He expertly directed our massive wealth into commercial real estate, high-yield bonds, and aggressive venture capital investments focused specifically on uplifting brilliant, underfunded minority founders. I maintained my highly influential board seat at Apex Holdings, flying first class to elite corporate meetings while continuing to advise the very tech empire I had built from scratch. We were operating at the absolute highest, most elite echelons of global wealth, yet our names purposefully remained completely absent from the local gossip circles and society pages. We built an impenetrable wall of silence around our monumental success, deeply knowing that our profound privacy was the ultimate luxury. We ensured Malik grew up shielded from the shallow materialism that corrupted so many wealthy children. He had access to the absolute best private tutors, pediatricians, and resources the world could possibly offer, but we taught him the fierce value of hard work and quiet dignity. We read to him in the expansive sunlit library of our estate, constantly reminding him that true power never has to shout its existence to the world. For 4 solid years, we lived in this beautiful, meticulously crafted bubble of silence. We never once reached out to Brenda, Vanessa, or DeAndre. They had drawn their brutal line in the sand, and we had happily left them standing on the wrong side of it. They believed we were still struggling, rotting away in some tiny apartment, drowning in debt and regret. We let them blindly hold on to that comforting, pathetic delusion. It was the absolute perfect setup for the reckoning that was slowly, inevitably approaching. The unbroken, deeply peaceful silence of 4 years was shattered on a crisp Tuesday morning in early December. Trevin and I were sitting in the massive, sun-drenched kitchen of our Milton estate, watching 4-year-old Malik happily assembling a complex wooden train set on the heated marble floor. Trayvon was casually reviewing quarterly commercial real estate acquisition reports on his tablet when his personal cell phone suddenly vibrated against the granite countertop. He glanced down at the glowing caller identification screen, and his entire body instantly went rigid. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and deep suspicion. "It is my mother," Trayvon said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "She has not called this number in 48 months. I set down my coffee mug, feeling an immediate electric surge of sharp adrenaline course through my veins. "Answer it," I instructed calmly, leaning forward in my chair. "Put it on speakerphone right now. Let us hear exactly what she wants." Trevin tapped the screen and placed the phone carefully on the table. "Hello," he said, keeping his tone aggressively neutral and completely devoid of any familial warmth. Trayvon baby Brenda's voice echoed through the pristine kitchen. It was dripping with a highly exaggerated, sickeningly sweet, church lady tone that I instantly recognized as completely fake. "Oh, praise the Lord, you actually answered. It has been far too long, my sweet boy. I have been praying on it, and the Lord placed it heavily on my heart that our family desperately needs to heal. We need to put all that silly, unfortunate past business behind us." Trayvon and I exchanged a long, intensely knowing look. Brenda never called anyone simply to heal or apologize. She only reached out when she had a distinct, calculated agenda. "What do you want, Mom?" Trayvon asked flatly, refusing to entertain her manipulative, superficial warmth. "Well, I was just hoping we could all finally get together for the holidays." Brenda continued, her voice completely ignoring his cold reception. "Vanessa and DeAndre just closed on a brand new, absolutely gorgeous mansion right in the heart of Buckhead. It is a stunning, massive property, Trayvon, simply breathtaking. They are hosting a huge, elegant Christmas dinner for the entire family, and they specifically told me to invite you, Nia and little Malik. We want to see our grandson. It is time to let bygones be bygones and celebrate the season together under one very blessed roof." I instantly saw right through the thick, deceptive layers of her pathetic invitation. This had absolutely nothing to do with healing grace or wanting to see a grandson she had ignored for 4 entire years. I knew exactly how their shallow status, obsessed minds operated. I quickly pulled out my phone and did a rapid search for DeAndre's professional profile online. There it was, posted just 2 days ago. He had finally been promoted from junior vice president to senior vice president at his legacy investment fund. I tapped Trayvon's arm and silently turned my phone screen toward him, tapping my manicured nail directly on DeAndre's shiny new job title. Trayvon read the screen, and a dark, deeply cynical smirk slowly spread across his handsome face. The picture was perfectly clear. DeAndre had secured his long-awaited promotion. Vanessa had secured a heavily mortgaged Buckhead mansion to match his new corporate status, and now they desperately needed a captive audience. They wanted to drag the struggling, impoverished brother and his failed entrepreneur wife into their shiny new palace, just to rub our faces in their perceived financial superiority. They wanted to force us to eat their expensive catered food, while DeAndre bragged about his corporate dominance, reinforcing the cruel narrative they had spun 4 years ago. Trayvon looked at me silently, asking for direction. He covered the phone microphone with his hand. "Tell her no," he whispered. "I am not subjecting you to their toxic garbage ever again. We do not need this." I shook my head slowly, a fiercely predatory smile forming on my lips. The absolute perfect moment I had been waiting 4 years for had finally miraculously presented itself on a silver platter. They wanted an audience. They wanted to flex their pathetic, fragile wealth. I was going to give them the exact audience they requested, but I was going to completely incinerate their entire stage. "Tell her yes," I whispered back, my eyes locking onto his with absolute terrifying conviction. "Tell her we would absolutely love to come admire their new house and celebrate DeAndre's big promotion. Tell her we will see them on Christmas night." Trayvon stared at me for a split second, seeing the cold, calculated fire burning behind my eyes. He smiled, uncovered the microphone, and cleared his throat. "You know what Mom," Trayvon said, his voice perfectly mimicking a tone of humble, defeated gratitude. "You are right. It has been a long time. Nia and I would love to come to Christmas dinner and see the new house. Please tell Vanessa and DeAndre we graciously accept their invitation." "Oh, wonderful!" Brenda practically squealed, her voice betraying her sheer malicious delight at successfully luring her seemingly broken son back into the fold. "It will be so good for you to see how well DeAndre is doing. Dress warmly, Trayvon. I know your apartment probably gets drafty this time of year. We will see you at 7 o'clock sharp on Christmas." The call ended. I sat back in my chair, looking around my massive multi-million-dollar kitchen and then down at my beautiful, healthy son. The trap was officially set. The arrogant predators had foolishly invited the ultimate apex predator directly into their home, entirely unaware that the corporate hierarchy they worshipped had already shifted dramatically beneath their feet. I stood up, walked over to Trayvon, and wrapped my arms around his neck. "We are going to Christmas dinner," I said, feeling a dangerous, highly anticipated thrill rushing through my entire body. "And we are going to burn their arrogant little house of cards straight to the ground." Christmas evening arrived with a biting, bitter cold that swept down from the Appalachian foothills and settled heavily over the sprawling city of Atlanta. We had made the strategic decision to leave Malik safely at our Milton estate under the watchful, loving care of my mother. There was absolutely no way I was going to subject my innocent, beautiful child to the toxic, deeply dysfunctional environment we were about to walk into. Tonight was strictly a tactical operation. Trayvon and I climbed into my unassuming dark gray Volvo SUV. We bypassed the fleet of exotic custom supercars sitting quietly in our climate-controlled subterranean garage. We needed to look the part of the struggling, humbled couple they desperately wanted us to be. The drive into Buckhead was quiet, filled with an electric, pulsing anticipation. As we turned onto the exclusive tree-lined street where DeAndre and Vanessa had recently purchased their new home, the blatant desperation for status became immediately apparent. Their property was a massive, aggressively modern mansion that looked completely out of place among the classic, understated brick estates of the older money neighborhood. The front of their house was blindingly illuminated by dozens of harsh landscape lights, designed to ensure that absolutely every passing car noticed the sheer magnitude of their perceived wealth. A brand-new bright red Porsche and a pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon were parked diagonally across the circular driveway, purposely positioned like expensive museum exhibits rather than actual modes of transportation. Trayvon parked our completely unbranded, modest-looking SUV near the edge of the driveway, making sure not to block their flashy mechanical trophies. He turned off the engine, took a deep, centering breath, and looked over at me with a sharp, knowing smile. "Let the games begin," he said quietly. We walked up the sweeping, oversized marble staircase, leading to their massive, double front doors. The doors were constructed of heavy iron and glass adorned with overly ornate handles that felt desperately pretentious. Trayvon pressed the illuminated doorbell, which chimed with an unnecessarily loud, complex melody that echoed into the cold night air. We stood on the porch as the freezing wind whipped around us, the temperature dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared entirely below the tree line. Through the frosted glass panes, I could see movement inside the brightly lit foyer. However, the door did not open immediately. We waited for 2 full minutes in the biting cold before the heavy lock finally clicked and the door swung inward. Vanessa stood in the entryway holding a crystal champagne flute. She was draped in a loud, incredibly flashy silk dress covered entirely in interlocking designer logos, making sure everyone within a 10-mile radius knew exactly how much she had spent on it. "Well, look who actually showed up," Vanessa drawled, her voice dripping with artificial syrupy sweetness that barely masked her profound arrogance. She did not step aside to let us in. She simply stood planted in the center of the doorway, letting the freezing winter wind blast directly into our faces. "I honestly thought you two might not have enough gas money to make it all the way out to Buckhead." "Merry Christmas to you too, Vanessa," Trevon said, his voice perfectly, even completely refusing to take her bait. "It is freezing out here. Are you going to let us inside?" Vanessa sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as if our mere presence was an exhausting burden she was graciously bearing. "Oh, right. Come into the foyer. Just the foyer, though." She stepped back exactly 1 pace, allowing us to cross the threshold, but she immediately held up her manicured hand to stop us from walking any further into the house. "Do not step on the Brazilian hardwood with your street shoes. I need to go find our new maid so she can take your damp coats. Hang tight right here. It is so incredibly hard to find good help these days, you know." Without waiting for a response, Vanessa spun around on her designer heels and walked away, disappearing into the cavernous depths of her ridiculously oversized house. She intentionally left the heavy iron front door cracked open behind us, allowing the freezing December wind to continue howling violently into the marble foyer. It was a classic transparent power play. She wanted us to stand shivering in the cold entryway, like unwanted delivery workers, reminding us of our supposed place at the absolute bottom of her social hierarchy. Trevon instinctively reached forward to pull the heavy front door completely shut, blocking out the bitter chill. He wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, pulling me close to share his body heat. "I cannot believe she is actually making us stand in a freezing hallway, while she pretends to look for a maid," he whispered, his jaw clenching with rising irritation. "I should go find her and tell her exactly what I think of her pathetic hospitality." I gently squeezed his arm, looking around the aggressively decorated space. "Let her have her petty little moment, Trayvon," I whispered back, a slow, predatory smile forming on my lips. "Look around. Everything in this house screams new money insecurity." The gold-plated mirror frames the fake marble columns, the oversized chandelier that looks like it belongs in a cheap Vegas casino. They are drowning in debt just to project an image of power. Standing in this cold hallway does not diminish us. It only exposes exactly how deeply insecure she truly is. We stood patiently in the drafty, freezing foyer for exactly 10 excruciating minutes. The sheer disrespect was palpable, heavy, and entirely intentional. But I did not feel humiliated or small. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm, absolute superiority. I knew with unwavering certainty that I could purchase this entire tacky mansion, bulldoze it to the ground, and build a parking lot with the spare change sitting idly in my secondary investment accounts. Vanessa was playing checkers with a plastic crown, completely unaware that she was aggressively insulting the owner of the entire board. Finally, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Vanessa's heels echoed across the hardwood floors as she returned to the foyer. She was entirely alone. There was no maid trailing behind her, proving that the entire 10-minute wait in the freezing cold had been nothing but a deliberate, malicious delay tactic designed solely to make us feel unwanted and deeply inferior. "I guess the help is busy in the kitchen, preparing the catered spread," Vanessa announced smoothly, not offering a single shred of apology for the wait. "You can just throw your coats over that chair in the corner. Try not to wrinkle the upholstery." As Trayvon and I removed our winter coats, Vanessa's highly critical eyes immediately darted up and down my body, conducting a rapid, aggressively judgmental visual audit of my clothing. I was not wearing anything flashy. There were absolutely no interlocking G's, no giant metallic clasps, and no recognizable branding patterns anywhere on my body. I was wearing a deeply understated, meticulously tailored camel-colored ensemble. What Vanessa's untrained status, obsessed eyes failed to recognize was that my outfit was constructed entirely of vicuna cashmere hand-stitched by a master artisan in Milan. The soft, unbranded sweater and matching trousers draped flawlessly against my skin, representing a level of elite quiet luxury that screamed wealth to anyone who actually belonged to that world. The entire bespoke outfit cost well over $5,000, excluding the custom Italian leather loafers on my feet. Vanessa, draped in her loud walking billboard of a dress, let out a condescending little scoff. She crossed her arms, a look of faux sympathy washing over her heavily contoured face. "Oh, Nia," Vanessa cooed, tilting her head to the side. "You look so incredibly cozy. Did you hit a decent post-Thanksgiving sale at one of those discount outlet malls? I know things must be incredibly tight for you guys right now, with Trevon working whatever little entry-level job he managed to find. But you really could have made a slight effort to dress up for a formal holiday dinner. I would have gladly lent you one of my old dresses from last season if you had just asked. We do have a certain aesthetic we try to maintain here in Buckhead." Trevon opened his mouth, a sharp defensive retort locked and loaded on his tongue, but I quickly squeezed his hand to silence him. I did not want to ruin the beautiful impending explosion by detonating the bomb too early in the foyer. I needed her ego to inflate to its absolute maximum capacity before I mercilessly popped it. I offered Vanessa a warm, unbothered, and completely serene smile. "Oh, you know me, Vanessa," I said, my voice perfectly light and pleasant. "I prefer to keep things simple and comfortable. You certainly do look very expensive tonight. All those logos really make a very loud statement." Vanessa beamed, completely missing the subtle razor-sharp insult hidden beneath my polite delivery. "Well, when DeAndre is crushing it at the firm the way he is, we have to dress the part of a power couple. It is just the reality of our social bracket." "Right," I replied smoothly. I reached into my unbranded custom leather tote bag and pulled out the single item we had brought with us. I had specifically stopped at a cheap corner liquor store on the drive over and purchased a widely recognized, deeply unimpressive bottle of mass-market wine that cost exactly $15. I held the bottle out toward her, keeping my serene smile firmly plastered on my face. We wanted to bring a little something to contribute to the dinner. Merry Christmas. Vanessa stared at the cheap bottle of wine as if I had just handed her a bag of toxic medical waste. She slowly took it from my hand, holding it by the very top of the neck with 2 fingers, physically holding it away from her expensive silk dress. She inspected the mass-market label, her upper lip curling into a distinct sneer of pure disgust. "Wow," Vanessa muttered, letting out a sharp, breathless laugh of sheer disbelief. $15 wine. How incredibly thoughtful of you, Nia. I will be sure to hand this directly to the catering staff in the kitchen. I think they might need some cheap liquid to deglaze the roasting pans. I certainly cannot serve this to our guests. DeAndre has prepared a selection of vintage Bordeaux that actually matches the caliber of this evening." She turned on her heel, clutching the cheap wine bottle like a weapon. "Come along, then," she commanded over her shoulder, not bothering to look back at us. "DeAndre and Mom are waiting in the formal dining room. Try not to touch any of the artwork on your way through the hall." Trevon and I shared one final, highly anticipated look of absolute solidarity. The trap was perfectly laid. The arrogance was suffocating. We stepped off the freezing marble of the foyer and walked deeper into the lion's den, ready to face the very people who had ruthlessly discarded us, entirely unaware that they were about to be thoroughly and permanently conquered. The formal dining room was a masterclass in aggressive, desperate extravagance. A massive crystal chandelier hung precariously over a long mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. The table was draped in heavy silk linens and crowded with towering floral centerpieces that made it nearly impossible to see the person sitting directly across from you. A private catering staff, dressed in crisp white uniforms and wearing white cotton gloves, moved silently around the room, pouring vintage wine into gold-rimmed crystal goblets. DeAndre had positioned himself at the absolute head of the table. He sat slumped back in his oversized velvet-upholstered chair, with his legs crossed, looking like a petty tyrant holding court in his rented kingdom. Vanessa sat immediately to his right, and Brenda was seated to his left. Trayvon and I were directed to the very far end of the table, purposely seated as far away from the hosts as physically possible. It was a clear, unmistakable physical manifestation of our supposed rank in this toxic family hierarchy. The moment the catering staff placed the first course of seared scallops and caviar in front of us, DeAndre cleared his throat loudly. He tapped his heavy silver fork against his crystal water glass, demanding absolute silence and attention from the entire room. He did not bother to welcome us to his home or offer a traditional holiday blessing. He immediately launched into a booming, self-congratulatory monologue about his own perceived corporate brilliance. Trayvon, I know you probably do not follow the high-level financial markets anymore since you left the corporate world. DeAndre began, his voice echoing loudly off the garish gold-patterned wallpaper. But my legacy fund just closed an absolutely massive quarter. We successfully raised $50 million in fresh capital for our new mezzanine financing vehicle. DeAndre paused, looking around the table with a smug, self-satisfied grin, clearly waiting for an eruption of applause. When Trayvon simply continued cutting his food without reacting, DeAndre leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany table. He narrowed his eyes intentionally, trying to make my husband feel small and uneducated. I am not sure if you even understand what mezzanine financing is these days. Trayvon. DeAndre continued, his tone dripping with thick, patronizing condescension. It is highly complex, aggressive corporate debt restructuring. We are talking about massive liquidity events, complex cap tables, and astronomical return on investment for our elite institutional partners. $50 million is a staggering amount of liquid capital to manage. It requires a level of cutthroat financial literacy and high-stakes stress management that most regular people simply cannot comprehend. I practically live in boardrooms with the most powerful executives in the state. We are driving the entire local economy, while average people are just scraping by, trying to figure out how to pay their utility bills. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my scallop, chewing silently, as I listened to DeAndre aggressively inflate his own ego. The sheer profound irony of his boast was almost too delicious to handle. He was aggressively puffing out his chest over raising $50 million of other people's money. He was an employee, a middleman collecting a modest management fee. He had absolutely no idea that he was actively attempting to flex his corporate muscles at a woman who had just personally pocketed $600 million in cold hard cash and equity. $50 million was a rounding error in my secondary investment portfolio. I could fund his entire highly touted legacy fund out of my own checking account and barely notice the deduction. Yet DeAndre continued to ramble, tossing out increasingly ridiculous financial buzzwords in a desperate attempt to assert his dominance over my husband. He talked about EBITDA series funding rounds and aggressive market capitalization as if he were explaining basic addition to a toddler. You see, Trayvon, true wealth is about scale, DeAndre lectured, pointing his fork directly at my husband. It is about understanding macroeconomic trends and positioning yourself alongside massive corporate entities. You cannot generate real wealth by playing small, safe games. You have to be in the room where the multi-million-dollar decisions are being made. That is exactly why Vanessa and I are sitting in a $3 million estate right now. We understand scale. We understand power. I look at guys who wash out of the finance industry, guys who settle for mediocre, ordinary lives, and I honestly pity them. They just do not have the killer instinct required to run with the big dogs. Trayvon did not flinch. He did not let a single ounce of DeAndre's toxic manufactured arrogance penetrate his peace. My husband simply looked up from his plate, offered a calm, unbothered smile, and took a sip of his sparkling water. That sounds like a very stressful job, DeAndre Trayvon replied smoothly. I am glad you are finding ways to keep yourself busy. DeAndre's face flushed a deep, angry shade of red. He hated that Trayvon was completely immune to his financial bullying. He hated that his $50 million boast had bounced harmlessly off my husband's impenetrable armor of quiet confidence. DeAndre opened his mouth to deliver another hostile insult, but before he could speak, Brenda aggressively jumped into the conversation to defend her precious high-earning son-in-law. Brenda could not stand the sight of Trayvon remaining so perfectly calm and composed. She needed her biological son to feel the sharp, agonizing sting of failure. She needed him to deeply regret the day he chose to walk out of her living room and support my ambitions. Brenda pushed her own plate aside and leaned entirely toward DeAndre. With a sickening, highly exaggerated display of maternal devotion, she actually picked up her heavy silver knife and fork, reached across the fine table linens, and delicately cut a premium slice of prime rib directly from DeAndre's plate. Oh, DeAndre, you work so incredibly hard to provide this beautiful, lavish lifestyle for my daughter. Brenda cooed loudly, ensuring her voice carried down the length of the long table. She carefully picked up the piece of meat with her fork and practically spoon-fed it to the grown man sitting beside her. You are the absolute pillar of this family. You carry the weight of the corporate world on your broad shoulders, and you still manage to host us in this breathtaking mansion. You are exactly the kind of strong, providing man I always prayed my daughter would marry. DeAndre chewed the prime rib with a smug, victorious grin, visibly soaking in the toxic, sycophantic worship. Brenda then turned her head slowly, fixing her cold, deeply judgmental eyes directly on Trayvon. She let out a long, heavy, theatrical sigh that was meant to convey years of profound, agonizing maternal disappointment. "See, Trayvon Brenda," said her voice turning sharp and incredibly cruel as it sliced through the polite clinking of silverware. "If you had not stubbornly thrown your entire life away on foolish, impossible dreams, you could be sitting at the head of a gorgeous table exactly like this one. You could be a highly respected, successful man providing a secure, luxurious life for your family instead of constantly struggling just to keep your head above water." Brenda shook her head slowly, looking at Trayvon with a deeply manufactured sense of pity. "It honestly breaks my heart to see how far you have fallen, Trayvon. I raised you to be a leader, a man of profound status and wealth. You had such a bright, promising future in the financial sector. But you chose to sacrifice your entire career and your dignity to support Nia's little lotion hobby. And look exactly where that catastrophic decision got you. You are sitting at the far end of your sister's table wearing cheap clothes, probably wondering how you are going to pay your heating bill next month." The sheer, unadulterated venom in her words was breathtaking. Brenda was actively trying to publicly emasculate her own son, weaponizing DeAndre's perceived success to crush Trayvon's spirit. She wanted him to break down to admit he had made a terrible mistake by choosing me over her toxic financial control. "Look at this magnificent home," Brenda continued, gesturing wildly around the garish, overly decorated dining room. "Look at the absolute abundance DeAndre has provided. This is what real success looks like. This is what happens when a man focuses on realistic, highly profitable corporate careers instead of chasing delusional fantasies. I tried to warn you 4 years ago, Trayvon. I begged you to be sensible to force Nia to get a real job. But you turned your back on your own mother. Now you are forced to live with the miserable, impoverished consequences of your stubborn pride." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my lap beneath the heavy silk tablecloth. I watched Brenda aggressively project her completely false narrative onto our lives. She was so entirely convinced of her own superiority. She was so blindly confident that we were drowning in poverty because we did not fit her shallow, materialistic definition of success. She had absolutely no idea that the clothes Trayvon was wearing cost more than the elaborate catering spread sitting on her daughter's table. She had no idea that we had arrived in a heavily armored vehicle or that our private estate in Milton made this Buckhead mansion look like a cramped, cheap starter home. Trayvon simply looked at his mother, his expression radiating nothing but profound, quiet pity. He did not argue. He did not defend our bank accounts or our lifestyle. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew the massive, devastating payload I was holding patiently in my hands. He looked across the table at me, his eyes shining with a deep, fierce love, and gave me a barely perceptible nod. The stage was perfectly set. The villains had proudly displayed their absolute worst, most toxic behavior. They had built their fragile, arrogant house of cards as high as it could possibly go. It was finally time for me to burn it all straight to the ground. Vanessa watched her mother finish berating Trayvon with a look of absolute, unadulterated glee. She took a long, exaggerated sip from her crystal goblet, leaving a bright red smudge of expensive lipstick on the rim. The dining room was suffocatingly quiet for a brief second before Vanessa decided it was finally her turn to step into the spotlight. She set her glass down with a sharp clink, leaned heavily across the mahogany table, and locked her malicious eyes directly onto mine. So Vanessa began, her voice dripping with the exact same venomous, mocking tone she had used in Brenda's living room 4 years ago. We have spent all this time talking about DeAndre's massive corporate success and Trayvon's unfortunate career choices, but we have not heard a single word about you. Tell us, how is that cute little lotion hustle of yours going? Are you still mixing cheap shea butter in your tiny apartment kitchen and begging your broke friends to buy it on Instagram? DeAndre let out a loud, obnoxious snort, shaking his head as he sliced into another piece of prime rib. Brenda smiled approvingly at her daughter, clearly thrilled that the aggressive interrogation had shifted to her favorite target. They were operating like a highly coordinated pack of wolves, taking turns tearing at our dignity for their own twisted entertainment. I kept my posture perfectly relaxed, leaning back into my plush dining chair. I rested my hands gracefully on my lap, ensuring my expression remained entirely serene and unbothered. I did not break eye contact with Vanessa. I let her harsh, mocking words hang in the heavy air, giving her all the rope she desperately needed to hang herself. It must be incredibly exhausting. Vanessa continued, interpreting my calm silence as defeated humiliation. Trying to pretend you are some kind of tech visionary when everyone in this room knows exactly what you really are. A girl from the rough side of Atlanta playing dress-up. I genuinely want to know, Nia. Does it pay the bills? Does selling homemade creams to a dozen followers actually cover your rent? Or is Trevon working double shifts at some miserable entry-level job just to keep the lights on for you? She reached out and adjusted a massive, garish diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, ensuring the dining room lights caught the stones perfectly. Because living in Atlanta has gotten so incredibly expensive lately, Vanessa bragged, her voice raising in pitch so the catering staff hovering near the kitchen doors could hear her wealth. Just this morning, DeAndre and I dropped $20,000 at Phipps Plaza, upgrading our winter wardrobes. I simply cannot imagine the constant grinding stress of having to check a bank account balance before buying basic necessities. It must be absolutely terrifying for you, especially with a young child to feed. You really should have listened to my mother 4 years ago. You should have swallowed your ridiculous pride and gotten a job working a cash register or answering phones. At least then you would not be a total parasite draining my brother's life away. Every single word she spat across the table was a direct, calculated echo of the profound cruelty she had subjected me to on the day Trevon lost his job. She was aggressively attempting to transport us back to that exact moment of absolute vulnerability. She wanted me to feel small, desperate, and entirely powerless in her lavish new home. She wanted to assert her dominance as the wealthy, highly successful sister-in-law who had everything I could never achieve. I took a slow, deliberate breath, maintaining my flawless mask of polite attention. My internal monologue, however, was roaring with a fierce, predatory anticipation. She had no idea that the woman sitting across from her possessed a financial arsenal so incredibly vast that it could permanently obliterate her entire fragile reality. She was arrogantly boasting about a $20,000 shopping spree to a woman who routinely moved tens of millions of dollars in aggressive venture capital investments before breakfast. "Oh, Vanessa," I said, my voice soft, pleasant, and completely devoid of the anger she was so desperately trying to provoke. "You have always been so incredibly invested in my career path. Your deep concern for my financial well-being is truly touching. It is fascinating how closely you follow my journey." Vanessa scoffed loudly, slamming her hand flat against the heavy silk tablecloth. "I do not follow your journey, Nia. I tolerate your presence because my brother was foolish enough to marry you. I am just stating the harsh reality that nobody else in this family has the courage to say to your face. You are a failure. You have spent years dragging Trayvon down into poverty because you refuse to accept your place in society. You are nothing but a burden, a complete financial drain on a man who used to have actual potential." As the catering staff began moving silently around the grand dining room to clear the empty appetizer plates, Vanessa suddenly held up her manicured hand, gesturing aggressively for the workers to stop. She turned her entire body toward me, a malicious, deeply cruel glint flashing in her eyes. The ultimate power play was forming in her status-obsessed mind. Actually, Vanessa announced, her voice echoing sharply across the room. The catering staff can take a quick break. Nia's going to clear the table for us tonight. Trevon's spine snapped completely straight. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping furiously in his cheek. He immediately placed his hands flat on the table, preparing to stand up and completely dismantle the room, but I swiftly reached under the heavy silk linens and gripped his knee. I squeezed it twice, our silent, unbreakable code. Hold the line, let her finish. Vanessa pushed her dirty, smeared plate aggressively across the polished mahogany wood, shoving it directly toward my side of the table. You heard me, Naya. Get up and start collecting the dishes. Since you and my brother obviously cannot afford to contribute anything of actual value to a high-class dinner like this, you can absolutely contribute your manual labor. That $15 bottle of cheap corner store wine you handed me in the foyer was a profound insult to this entire house. It does not even begin to cover the cost of the imported caviar you just ate. DeAndre let out a loud, booming laugh, leaning back in his velvet chair and crossing his arms triumphantly. He looked at his wife with absolute, unfiltered pride. Brenda nodded along vigorously, a tight, wicked smile stretching across her face as she pushed her own dirty plate toward the center of the table. That is an excellent point, Vanessa, Brenda chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic validation. In this family, everyone has to pull their own weight. Since Nia refuses to work a real job and provide financial stability for her household, she can certainly make herself useful right now. Go on, Nia. Gather the plates and take them into the kitchen. I am sure the catering crew could use some extra help scrubbing the heavy roasting pans. Freeloaders need to earn their keep somehow. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the command hung heavily in the air. They were actually ordering me, a guest in their home, to stand up and act as their unpaid domestic servant, simply because they falsely believed my bank account balance was lower than theirs. They were attempting to publicly strip away my fundamental human dignity to make themselves feel like royalty. Vanessa tapped her long acrylic nails impatiently against the edge of the table. We are waiting, Nia. Stand up, collect the plates and take them to the sink, and try not to drop any of the fine china on your way out. It costs significantly more than your entire life savings. Trayvon was physically shaking with rage beside me, his breathing heavy and ragged, as he stared absolute daggers at his arrogant sister and his toxic mother. He was ready to burn the entire house down to defend me. But I did not need defending. I was not the terrified, desperate, heavily pregnant woman standing in Brenda's living room 4 years ago. I was an untouchable, verified titan of industry, sitting patiently in a room full of absolute clowns. I calmly reached for the crisp white linen napkin resting on my lap. I slowly, elegantly lifted it and gently dabbed the corners of my mouth, ensuring my movements were perfectly poised and unhurried. I placed the napkin neatly beside my crystal water glass. I did not stand up. I did not reach for a single dirty plate. I simply locked my eyes directly onto Vanessa's impatient, sneering face, letting a slow, devastatingly calm smile spread across my lips. The trap had been triggered. The absolute highest peak of their arrogance had been reached. It was time for the drop. I did not move a single muscle toward those dirty plates. Instead, I let my back sink deeply into the plush, velvet upholstery of the dining chair. I allowed my shoulders to drop, releasing any remaining physical tension, and crossed my legs comfortably beneath the heavy silk tablecloth. The absolute refusal to obey her command hung in the stifling air of the formal dining room, generating a thick, palpable friction that you could practically cut with a knife. Vanessa stared at me, her heavily contoured face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. She was entirely accustomed to people cowering under her aggressive demands. She expected me to flush with deep embarrassment, to burst into tears of shame, or to stand up and scream in defensive anger. She expected a loud, chaotic reaction that would perfectly validate her racist, classist assumptions about my character and my background. I denied her that satisfaction. I remained completely grounded, anchored by the massive, invisible financial empire I commanded. I slowly lifted my right hand and picked up my crystal water goblet, bypassing it entirely for the glass of vintage Bordeaux DeAndre had poured earlier. I brought the delicate crystal rim to my lips and took a long, incredibly slow and deliberate sip. The expensive red wine was rich and full-bodied, a perfect pairing for the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. I swallowed smoothly, savoring the complex taste, and then gently placed the glass back onto the mahogany table with a soft, resonant clink. I reached for the crisp white linen napkin resting near my plate. With meticulous, unhurried precision, I lifted it and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin perfectly in half and laid it flat beside my heavy silverware. Every single movement I made was aggressively slow, completely disrupting the frantic toxic energy Vanessa and Brenda were trying to force upon me. I was operating on my own timeline, establishing total dominion over the physical space without raising my voice a single decibel. "Are you deaf?" "Nia," Vanessa snapped, her voice rising to a shrill, highly agitated pitch. Her manicured fingers gripped the polished edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I told you to get up and clear these plates right now. Stop sitting there acting like you belong at this table. You are a guest in my $3 million home, and you need to start showing some basic respect to the people who are actively feeding you and putting a roof over your head tonight." Brenda leaned forward from her seat next to DeAndre, her eyes narrowing with malicious intent. "Do not ignore your sister-in-law, Nia. It is extremely rude and highly ungrateful. If you cannot behave like a responsible adult and pitch in when asked, you and Trayvon can leave my daughter's house right now. We do not tolerate lazy freeloaders in this family, and we certainly do not tolerate disrespect toward the primary breadwinners." Trayvon shifted beside me, his large frame radiating an intense protective heat. He was a fraction of a second away from unleashing 4 years of suppressed rage onto his mother and sister. But I pressed my hand firmly against his thigh under the table, a silent command to remain completely still. I wanted to handle this personally. I looked directly at Brenda, holding her cold gaze, until she instinctively blinked first, and then my gaze shifted smoothly back to Vanessa. I let a warm, genuinely relaxed and radiant smile spread across my face. It was not a defensive smirk or a forced, polite grin. It was the absolute unbothered smile of a woman who possessed total unrestricted freedom. "Oh, you mean my little worthless business?" I asked, my voice incredibly soft, pleasant, and conversational, completely contrasting the hostile hostility vibrating across the length of the dining table. I tilted my head slightly, feigning a look of mild, innocent realization, as if a trivial thought had just crossed my mind. "I completely forgot to update you all on my career status, since we have not spoken a single word to each other in 4 years. You really do not need to worry about my little lotion hustle causing Trayvon any more financial stress. Actually, I sold it. I am just a stay-at-home mom now." For a fraction of a second, the entire dining room remained perfectly still. The catering staff hovering near the kitchen doors stopped moving entirely. Then Vanessa let out a loud, aggressive, and incredibly ugly cackle. The sound erupted from her chest, bouncing harshly off the garish gold-patterned wallpaper and echoing up into the massive, dripping crystal chandelier. She threw her head back, laughing with such intense, malicious delight that she actually had to reach up and wipe a tear of joy from the corner of her heavily lashed eye. She looked over at DeAndre, pointing a shaking, manicured finger in my direction. "Sold it!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice breathless with hysterical, toxic laughter. "Oh my God, DeAndre, do you hear this? She actually sold her little imaginary company? Let me guess." "Nia, the crushing reality of the actual business world finally caught up to you. You realized you had absolutely no idea what you were doing, so you liquidated your cheap supplies to the highest bidder on some online marketplace just to escape the mounting debt." DeAndre joined in a deep, booming laugh escaping his chest. He shook his head, looking at Trayvon with immense mocking pity. "Well, at least she finally gave up the delusion, Trayvon." DeAndre chuckled, slicing aggressively into his prime rib with renewed, arrogant energy. "I see guys like her in the startup space all the time. They run out of capital, they panic, and they execute a desperate fire sale just to cover their outstanding liabilities before the bank seizes their personal assets. Tell us the truth, Nia. What did you get for it? A few $1,000s to pay off your maxed-out credit cards? Maybe enough to cover a couple of months of rent in whatever tiny roach-infested apartment you guys are currently hiding in. Brenda let out a heavy sigh of absolute maternal vindication. She clapped her hands together, looking up at the ceiling as if thanking a higher power. Well, praise the Lord. She finally woke up and smelled the coffee, Brenda announced, proudly taking a large sip of her wine. Now you can focus on finding a real job, Naya. Maybe Vanessa can recommend you for an entry-level receptionist position at DeAndre's firm. That way you can finally start pulling your own weight in your marriage instead of acting like a complete parasite on my son's potential. I let them laugh. I sat in absolute terrifying silence and let the cruel, condescending sound of their voices fill the massive dining room. I let them thoroughly enjoy the deeply false narrative they had instantly constructed in their own desperate status-obsessed minds. I sat perfectly still, observing the way their egos inflated with toxic validation. They needed me to be a failure so desperately because their entire sense of self-worth depended on having someone to look down upon. Slowly, the malicious laughter began to die down. The aggressive chuckles faded as the sheer lack of reaction from Trayvon and me began to unnerve them. Vanessa caught her breath, wiping the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, and fixed me with a look of supreme, untouchable arrogance. Seriously, though. Vanessa sneered, leaning forward across the table, desperately wanting to extract every single ounce of humiliation from my supposed financial defeat. How much did your little fire sale actually bring in 5,000, 10,000? Please tell me you at least broke even on those cheap plastic bottles you were using for packaging. The lingering sounds in the room faded completely. The room settled into a heavy, expectant, and suffocating quiet. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hum of the massive central heating system pushing warm air through the expensive floor vents. I leaned forward, mirroring Vanessa's aggressive posture, but maintaining my absolute terrifying calm. I placed my forearms gently on the edge of the polished mahogany table and folded my hands together. I locked my eyes directly onto Vanessa's heavily contoured face. I stripped away the pleasant conversational smile, replacing it with a cold, piercing intensity that immediately caused her smug expression to falter. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly dense, as if the atmospheric pressure had just violently shifted. I did not break eye contact. I ensured my voice carried absolute, undeniable authority, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp, devastating precision that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. No, Vanessa. I said, my voice ringing out with terrifying, crystal-clear clarity in the dead, silent room. I sold it for $600 million. DeAndre stared at me across the sprawling mahogany table for 5 long seconds before a loud, booming laugh erupted from his chest. It was an aggressive, entirely forced sound designed to mask the sudden, uncomfortable tension gripping the dining room. He threw his head back, slapping his large hand flat against the heavy silk tablecloth, causing the crystal water goblets to rattle dangerously. $600 million. DeAndre mocked, shaking his head as if I had just told the most absurd, pathetic joke in human history. Nia, you have completely lost your mind. You are sitting at my dinner table drinking my vintage wine and spinning absolute fairy tales because your fragile ego cannot handle the reality of your poverty. $600 million. You do not even know what $1 million looks like on a bank statement. Vanessa immediately chimed in, eager to back up her arrogant husband. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her face contorted in a vicious sneer. You are actually delusional, Nia. This is beyond embarrassing. You think you can just invent a massive, historic corporate buyout to make us respect you. You are a desperate, pathological liar trying to save face because I asked you to wash my dishes. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my statement. I simply maintained my calm, predatory gaze, waiting for gravity to do its job. Let us just settle this ridiculous fantasy right now. DeAndre scoffed, reaching aggressively into the inner pocket of his tailored navy suit jacket. He pulled out his sleek smartphone, his thumbs moving furiously across the glowing screen. I am going to Google your name and your little imaginary tech company. Let us see exactly what the internet has to say about this massive, world-changing $600 million acquisition. I am sure the financial news networks are just buzzing about a girl from the south side of Atlanta selling homemade lotion. DeAndre typed my full name into the search bar. The dining room fell completely silent, save for the soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint, nervous breathing of the catering staff hovering near the kitchen doors. Everyone watched DeAndre. I watched the exact moment his entire reality fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. The bright blue light of his phone screen reflected off his eyes as the search results instantly loaded. The mocking, arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face vanished in a fraction of a second. The deep, rich color drained completely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His chest stopped moving. He physically stopped breathing. The confident, booming vice president of a legacy investment fund was suddenly reduced to a terrified, trembling statue. His left hand, which had been loosely holding his heavy, solid silver dining fork, suddenly lost all its strength. The heavy silver utensil slipped from his numb fingers and plummeted downward, striking his fine bone china plate with a loud, sharp, violent clatter that echoed like a gunshot through the silent dining room. He did not even notice the dropped fork. His eyes were wide, completely fixated on the glowing screen in his trembling right hand. "What is it?" Vanessa asked, her voice losing its aggressive edge, replaced by a sudden creeping anxiety. "DeAndre, what does it say?" "Stop playing around and tell her she is a liar." DeAndre could not speak. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was staring directly at the top search result. It was a massive, highly detailed feature article published by Forbes magazine just days after the acquisition cleared. The headline was undeniable, brutal, and crystal clear. It detailed the historic, industry-shattering $600 million acquisition of my supply chain logistics platform by a major global tech conglomerate. It featured a high-resolution photograph of my face looking directly into the camera, recognized globally as a pioneering titan of the business-to-business software industry. "DeAndre, answer me!" Vanessa demanded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. She pushed her chair back, ignoring the screech of the wooden legs against the hardwood floor, and scrambled over to her husband. She snatched the phone directly out of his paralyzed, shaking hand and looked at the screen. Vanessa gasped a sharp, ragged intake of breath that sounded like she was physically choking on the air. Her eyes darted wildly across the Forbes article, scanning the staggering financial figures, the details of my massive equity retention, and the quotes from industry experts praising my absolute genius. The phone slipped from her manicured fingers and tumbled onto the table, landing face up next to DeAndre's discarded prime rib. The screen remained illuminated, proudly displaying my face and my net worth to the entire table. Vanessa stumbled backward, practically falling into her velvet dining chair. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror and profound, suffocating humiliation. The woman who had just mockingly ordered me to scrub her dirty roasting pans was now staring at a verified multimillionaire. The financial dominance she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had just been entirely incinerated by the very woman she considered a peasant. Trevon sat beside me, slowly and casually cutting a piece of his steak. He took a bite, chewed methodically, and swallowed, before offering his sister a bright, completely unbothered smile. "The prime rib is excellent tonight, Vanessa," Trevon said, his voice dripping with smooth, effortless satisfaction. "You really outdid yourself." Brenda had been sitting frozen on the other side of DeAndre, watching the catastrophic psychological collapse of her golden daughter and her highly worshipped son-in-law. She leaned over, squinting her eyes to read the brightly illuminated phone screen resting on the tablecloth. I watched the exact moment her brain processed the number. $600 million. The absolute, staggering reality of that kind of wealth short-circuited her entire toxic, manipulative operating system. Brenda was the ultimate, ruthless opportunist. Her entire existence was defined by aligning herself with the highest earner in the room. For 4 years, that earner had been DeAndre. But in the span of 60 seconds, DeAndre had been demoted to a complete financial peasant, in comparison to the empire Trevon and I had built. Brenda's survival instinct kicked in with terrifying, whiplash-inducing speed. She realized she had just spent the last 20 minutes aggressively insulting a woman who could buy and sell her entire bloodline for sport. Brenda instantly switched masks. The cold, deeply judgmental sneer vanished completely, replaced by a massive, frantic, and incredibly desperate smile that stretched her facial features to their absolute breaking point. She let out a loud, theatrical gasp, clapping her hands together as if she had just witnessed a holy miracle right there in the Buckhead dining room. "Oh, praise God," Brenda shouted, her voice trembling with manufactured syrupy joy. "Praise the Lord Almighty, Nia, honey. I always knew you were an absolute genius. I knew from the very first day Traven brought you home that you were destined for absolute greatness. Look at what you have accomplished. We are family, Nia. We are blood. We should be popping champagne and celebrating this massive blessing for our entire family." Brenda aggressively pushed her chair back and lunged across the mahogany table. She reached both of her arms out, desperate to grab my hands, desperate to physically tether herself to my newfound unimaginable wealth. She knocked over a crystal water goblet in her frantic haste, sending a puddle of ice water spreading across the expensive silk linens. But she did not even care. She just wanted to touch the billionaire sitting across from her. I did not flinch. As her grasping, desperate hands reached toward mine, I violently yanked my hands back, pulling them flush against my chest. I looked at her with a gaze so incredibly cold and devoid of human warmth that she instantly froze in midair, her arms suspended awkwardly over the spilled water. "Do not ever touch me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register that cut through the room like a razor blade. "Do not ever refer to me as honey. And you absolutely do not get to use the word family when speaking to me." Brenda stammered, pulling her hands back as if she had been physically burned. Her fake, panicked smile wavered, but she desperately tried to keep it plastered on her face. "Nia, sweetie, you are just emotional. This is a huge moment. We need to come together. We need to celebrate Traven's massive success with his beautiful wife." "Celebrate?" I asked, leaning forward, closing the distance between us. "Let us talk about how you celebrate your family, Brenda. Let us talk about a freezing cold, suffocatingly tense afternoon in your sterile living room exactly 4 years ago. Do you remember that day? Do you remember looking at my swollen 8-month pregnant belly and calling me a delusional parasite? Do you remember sitting on your white leather sofa while your precious son-in-law threw a crisp $100 bill onto the carpet right at my feet, telling me to go buy diapers and get a real job?" Brenda's face drained of color. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room, desperately looking for a way to escape the brutal, undeniable truth of her own actions. "Nia, that was a long time ago. We were all just highly stressed." "I am not finished," I snapped, raising my hand to completely silence her pathetic excuses. "You did not just sit there and watch me be profoundly humiliated. You actively participated. You looked your own biological son in the eyes, a son who had just lost his job and was terrified about providing for his impending child, and you gave him an ultimatum. You told Traven he had to force me to abandon my company and kill my dreams, or you would cut him out of the family forever. You threatened to throw your own blood out into the street unless he submitted to your toxic financial control." I pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at DeAndre, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. "You chose him, Brenda. You worshipped him because he had a flashy title and a heavy wallet. You looked at my background, you looked at my lack of generational wealth, and you decided I was inherently worthless. You bet your entire family structure on the wrong horse." Brenda was hyperventilating now, tears of pure desperate panic welling in her eyes. "I was just giving you tough love, Nia," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she tried to spin her cruelty into maternal wisdom. "I wanted to motivate you. I wanted to push you to succeed. And look at you now. Look at how well it worked. My tough love pushed you to build this massive empire." "Tough love." Trevon finally spoke, his voice booming with profound, unwavering authority. "There was absolutely zero love in that room 4 years ago, Mom. There was only your sick, twisted obsession with money and status. Nia did not build a $600 million empire because of you. She built it in spite of you. She built it while you and Vanessa sat in your expensive houses and laughed at our poverty. You do not get to claim a single ounce of her victory. You do not get to share in this wealth. You severed your ties to us the moment you chose your ego over your own son. Brenda collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, as the absolute crushing reality of her catastrophic miscalculation settled heavily onto her shoulders. She had permanently alienated the wealthiest people she would ever know in her entire life. The fake, superficial family facade she had so desperately tried to reconstruct had been utterly, ruthlessly obliterated. I sat tall, watching her weep, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated justice. The dining room felt like a tomb. They were trapped in the wreckage of their own making, and the air was thick with the suffocating weight of their permanent downfall. I took another slow sip of my wine. The heavy, oppressive silence that had completely paralyzed the dining room was suddenly shattered by the aggressive scraping of wood against the hardwood floor. DeAndre violently pushed his velvet chair backward and stood up. His chest was heaving, his breathing ragged and uneven, as if he were physically suffocating under the immense crushing weight of my newly revealed net worth. He desperately adjusted the lapels of his custom navy suit, his hands visibly shaking, trying to physically reconstruct the fragile armor of his corporate identity. He looked down at the glowing phone screen that still proudly displayed my Forbes feature, and a dark, deeply defensive rage washed over his ashen face. He was a man who had built his entire identity on financial superiority, and being utterly dwarfed by a black woman he considered beneath him was completely breaking his mind. DeAndre planted his hands firmly on the edge of the mahogany table, leaning forward to loom over the space in a pathetic, desperate attempt to reclaim the physical dominance he had completely lost. He glared at me, his eyes wide and manic, refusing to accept the catastrophic shift in the power dynamic. "You think this changes anything?" DeAndre spat out, his voice loud, abrasive, and dripping with a toxic, deeply insecure arrogance. "You think flashing a headline from a magazine suddenly makes you my equal? Money does not buy class or status, Nia. You just got incredibly lucky. You caught a random wave in a highly volatile tech bubble, and you cashed out before the market realized your product was just a temporary trend. You are still new money. You are still the exact same uncultured, uneducated girl from the south side of Atlanta who begged my mother-in-law for a handout. You can buy all the expensive clothes you want, but you will absolutely never belong in the elite circles that actually run this city." Vanessa looked up at her husband, her tear-streaked face suddenly filling with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope. She desperately needed him to be right. She needed him to somehow mathematically prove that they were still superior, that their heavily mortgaged Buckhead mansion and their leased luxury cars still held some fundamental, untouchable value. DeAndre saw her looking at him and puffed his chest out, even further emboldened by his wife's desperate reliance on his ego. Real power is not about cashing a single lucky lottery ticket. DeAndre lectured, his voice echoing fiercely through the grand dining room as he desperately tried to rewrite the narrative. Real power is institutional. It is about generational legacy, deep corporate connections, and managing the fundamental pillars of the global economy. You are a flash in the pan, Nia. You are a temporary headline. But my career, my investment fund, Apex Holdings, represents true institutional power. We manage billions in untouchable legacy assets. We dictate the markets. We control the financial infrastructure that allows people like you to even exist. I sit in rooms with the most powerful, influential titans of the financial world every single day. The people I work for possess a level of permanent historical wealth that a sudden tech millionaire like you could not possibly begin to comprehend. He let out a sharp, condescending scoff, aggressively pointing his finger down the length of the table toward Trayvon and me. "You can sit there and smirk all you want," DeAndre snarled, his face twisted in pure elitist contempt. "But tomorrow morning, I am going to wake up, put on my suit, and walk into the executive offices of Apex Holdings as a senior vice president. I have an entire team of analysts answering directly to me. I command respect in the corporate hierarchy. You just stumbled into a massive pile of cash, but you have absolutely no real power, no real influence, and no actual standing in the corporate world. You are just a rich stay-at-home mom now, completely irrelevant to the global economy. I am the one shaping the future." Trevon sat perfectly still beside me. His broad shoulders relaxed, a look of profound, almost clinical fascination on his face. He watched DeAndre aggressively dig his own grave with the quiet amusement of a man watching a train speed toward a deliberately collapsed bridge. DeAndre had spent his entire adult life weaponizing his corporate title, using his position at Apex Holdings to belittle, degrade, and humiliate anyone who did not possess a comparable business card. He genuinely believed that his executive status rendered him completely untouchable. He believed his legacy fund was a fortified castle that I could never possibly breach. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, aggressive energy. I simply let him finish his desperate classist rant. I watched the heavy, frantic rise and fall of his chest as he tried to convince himself of his own superiority. Then I smoothly uncrossed my legs, reached down, and picked up my unbranded custom leather tote bag that was resting near the leg of my chair. I placed the bag onto my lap and reached inside. My fingers instantly found the crisp, thick, heavy parchment paper I had placed there just hours before we left for this dinner. I slowly pulled out a sleek, flawlessly white envelope. The heavy gold foil embossed logo of Apex Holdings gleamed brilliantly under the light of the massive crystal chandelier. I held the envelope lightly between my index and middle fingers, mirroring the exact degrading physical motion DeAndre had used when he threw that $100 bill at my feet 4 years ago. "Speaking of Apex Holdings, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft, razor-sharp whisper that effortlessly sliced through his lingering arrogance. "Did they tell you who the new majority shareholder is after the merger last week?" I casually flicked my wrist. The sleek, heavy envelope sailed smoothly through the air, gliding gracefully down the center of the massive mahogany table. It slid perfectly past the towering floral centerpieces and landed squarely on DeAndre's fine bone china plate, coming to a dead stop right next to his discarded silver fork. DeAndre stared down at the gold-embossed logo of his own employer. The aggressive defensive posture he had just built completely evaporated. His shoulders slumped forward, and his hands began to tremble violently once again. He looked back up at me, his eyes wide, completely devoid of comprehension, silently begging me not to say the words that were about to permanently end his life as he knew it. I did not just take cash for my company, I continued enunciating every single syllable with lethal, unyielding precision. When Apex Holdings realized my supply chain algorithms were absolutely essential to modernizing their entire global portfolio, I aggressively dictated the terms of the acquisition. I did not just take a $600 million payout, I took massive equity. And I demanded a board seat at Apex. DeAndre let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He reached out with a shaking, heavy hand and tore open the pristine white envelope. He pulled out the heavy cardstock document inside. It was the highly confidential internal corporate memorandum scheduled to be globally distributed to every single Apex employee at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. The bold, black text officially announced the closing of the historic acquisition. It clearly, undeniably listed my full legal name as the newly appointed executive board member holding a sweeping, dominant majority stake in the newly merged corporate entity. He read the document, his eyes darting frantically across the page, desperately searching for a typo, a mistake, a loophole, anything that could save him from the catastrophic reality of this moment. But there was no mistake. The document was signed by the current CEO of Apex Holdings, welcoming me to the absolute top of their corporate hierarchy. The specific, elite legacy investment fund that DeAndre was so incredibly proud of managing was now directly under my executive purview. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, closing the distance between us, with a cold, unrelenting stare. "You spent the last 4 years mocking me, DeAndre. You threw money at my feet and told me to get a real job. You just spent the last 10 minutes bragging about your precious institutional power, desperately trying to convince yourself that you are untouchable because you hold a meaningless middle management title at a legacy firm. but you fundamentally fail to understand how real power actually operates. DeAndre slowly lowered the document to the table. His mouth was hanging open, his face a portrait of complete, absolute devastation. The arrogant, untouchable senior vice president had just been thoroughly, mercilessly gutted in front of his entire family. "I am your ultimate boss now," I stated, my voice echoing with final, absolute authority. "You do not dictate the markets. You do not control the financial infrastructure. You are just a highly expendable employee, sitting in a borrowed cubicle. I own the building you work in. I control the funds you manage. I sit in the boardroom making the multi-million-dollar decisions you only get to read about in emails. You thought you could invite me to your tacky house and use your promotion to humiliate my husband? But you failed to realize that you are talking to the woman who signs your checks." Brenda let out a sharp, high-pitched whimper, covering her mouth with both hands, as the true horrifying reality of the situation washed over her. She had not just alienated her wealthy son, she had actively participated in verbally abusing the absolute most powerful corporate executive her golden son-in-law would ever answer to. Vanessa sat completely paralyzed, her eyes darting frantically between the Apex Holdings memorandum and my fiercely unbothered face. The lavish $3 million mansion around them suddenly felt entirely hollow, stripped of all its protective luxury, leaving them completely exposed to the catastrophic consequences of their own profound cruelty. The crushing weight of absolute realization settled over the dining room like a thick shroud. Vanessa could not handle the instantaneous destruction of her husband's ego or the undeniable proof of my corporate dominance. Her reality was violently shattering. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. Her chest heaved as she desperately tried to pull air into her lungs, hyperventilating in the face of my unwavering control. The grand illusion of elite status she had meticulously built over the past 4 years was collapsing all around her. She slammed both of her trembling hands onto the mahogany table, knocking over her crystal wine glass. The vintage Bordeaux spilled rapidly across the heavy silk tablecloth like a bleeding wound, but she did not even blink. She locked her terrified, furious eyes on me, desperately clinging to the very last scrap of superiority she thought she possessed. "Get out!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob that tore through the quiet room. Her perfectly contoured face was streaked with running mascara, completely ruining her glamorous facade. "Get out of my house right now, Nia. I do not care how much money you claim to have or what tech company you supposedly bought. You are nothing but a common street rat who got incredibly lucky. You can sit there and wave your corporate papers around, but at the end of the day, I still own this magnificent $3 million mansion. I have real tangible assets. You are sitting under my roof eating my food, and I want you out of my sight immediately." Trevon finally shifted in his velvet dining chair. He had remained incredibly silent throughout my entire execution of DeAndre, allowing me the space to fully dismantle the man who had thrown money at my feet 4 years ago. But now it was his turn to deliver the absolute death blow to his arrogant sister. Trayvon picked up his crisp linen napkin, elegantly wiped his mouth, and tossed it casually onto his plate. He looked at Vanessa with a cold, clinical detachment that perfectly mirrored my own unbothered demeanor. "Your house," Trevon asked, his voice smooth, low, and vibrating with dangerous authority. "That is a very interesting choice of words, Vanessa. Because according to the extremely detailed financial reports I personally manage for our family office, you and DeAndre do not actually own a single brick of this property." Vanessa froze, her manicured hands still pressed flat against the ruined tablecloth. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, casting a frantic glance at her husband. DeAndre refused to meet her eyes, choosing instead to stare blankly at his own trembling hands resting on his lap. "You could not secure a traditional jumbo mortgage because DeAndre is drowning in aggressive personal debt just to maintain your flashy lifestyle." Trevon continued, effortlessly exposing their deepest financial secrets to the entire room. "So you signed a highly leveraged rent-to-own contract through a private real estate holding company called Obsidian Trust. You put down a meager deposit and agreed to pay an astronomical monthly premium just to fake your elite status in Buckhead. Trevon leaned forward, resting his powerful forearms on the heavy mahogany table. The massive problem is, Vanessa, you are currently 3 full months behind on those exact payments. You are actively facing severe eviction protocols. But the far more catastrophic problem is who actually holds your specific residential contract. My brilliant wife aggressively diversified our investment portfolio last year. Nia owns Obsidian Trust. You do not own this mansion, Vanessa. You are severely delinquent tenants and you owe 3 months of back rent directly to my wife. The absolute devastation that washed over the formal dining room was total and beautifully complete. There was no more arrogance left to weaponize. There were no more flashy corporate titles or loud designer logos that could shield them from the catastrophic reality of their complete financial subjugation. Vanessa let out a loud, gut-wrenching wail and collapsed violently back into her dining chair, burying her sobbing face into her trembling hands. The grand Buckhead mansion she had desperately weaponized against me was legally and permanently mine, and she was entirely at my financial mercy. Brenda completely broke down. The toxic matriarch who had proudly commanded her son to abandon his pregnant wife was now openly weeping. She scrambled frantically out of her chair and rushed awkwardly around the large table, her expensive gold jewelry clanking loudly together. She reached out with shaking hands, desperately grabbing the sleeve of Trayvon's bespoke suit. "Trayvon, please." Brenda sobbed, her voice reduced to a pathetic whine that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "You cannot let her evict your sister from her home. We are blood. We are family. DeAndre will lose his high-paying job if Nia fires him, and they will be completely ruined. You have to talk to her right now. You have to make her show us some grace." Trayvon smoothly pulled his arm away from his mother's frantic grasp. He stood up to his full, intimidating height, towering over the weeping woman who had so ruthlessly banished us to poverty. "You made your definitive choice 4 years ago, Mom," Trayvon said, his voice entirely devoid of any residual sympathy. "You showed us exactly what your twisted version of grace looked like when you kicked us out into the brutal summer heat with a newborn baby. Do not beg me to save you from the massive empire my wife built while you actively mocked her survival." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back, with a quiet, deliberate scrape against the polished hardwood floor. I picked up my unbranded custom leather tote bag and gracefully slipped my luxurious cashmere coat over my shoulders. The entire room watched me with sheer terror, waiting for the final swing of the corporate guillotine. DeAndre finally looked up at me, his eyes terribly bloodshot and filled with absolute dread. He was silently waiting for me to fire him to officially strip away the single remaining pillar of his arrogant identity. I looked down at DeAndre, offering him one final, terrifyingly cold smile. "I am not firing you, DeAndre." I stated, my voice echoing with pure, unyielding authority. "Firing you would be entirely too easy. Firing you would let you escape the daily humiliation of your own reality. I want you to wake up every single morning at the crack of dawn. I want you to put on your expensive tailored suits, tie your silk ties, and commute through miserable Atlanta traffic to sit in my building. I want you to look at the Apex Holdings logo on your office wall and deeply know that every single cent that funds your leased luxury cars, your flashy clothes, and your massive mountain of debt comes directly from my personal bank account. I want you to spend the rest of your miserable corporate career knowing that your entire fake lifestyle is completely funded by a freeloader." I turned away from the devastated, violently sobbing ruins of my toxic in-laws. Trayvon placed a warm, intensely protective hand on the small of my back, and we walked together toward the grand marble foyer. We did not look back at Brenda begging pathetically on her knees, or Vanessa weeping uncontrollably into the wine-stained tablecloth, or DeAndre staring blankly into the dark abyss of his shattered ego. We walked out the heavy iron front doors and stepped into the freezing, crisp winter night air. We climbed into our unassuming SUV and drove away from the absolute wreckage, leaving them trapped forever in the inescapable prison of their own profound arrogance. There would be absolutely no forgiveness, no future reconciliation, and no family healing. There was only absolute cold poetic justice, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever built.